Good afternoon, colleagues, and a special welcome to our presenter, Mr. Evan Green. I am Nadini Prasad, Director of Professional Development at CEI, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this professional development session, Principles, Approaches, and Utilization of Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability, and Learning. Today we have Mr. Evan Green, who is a developer, monitor, and evaluator of international development projects and programs and national, regional, and international strategies, programs, and plans, as well as the Vice President and Senior Partner for Baastel, managing the results-based management and strategic planning, monitoring, and evaluation, and disaster risk management units. He specializes in the development of large and complex M&E frameworks, tools, and systems for national and regional organizations with a particular focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. Evan has extensive experience in RBM and M&E capacity building and frequently designs and implements participatory capacity building workshops for project and program design, the development of M&E tools and systems, and offers M&E and RBM guidance to projects, governments, regional and international agencies, and development partners around the world. Evan is currently the Canadian representative to EVAL SDGs. He has a multidisciplinary master's degree in public policy and public administration, specializing in international development and policy and project management. Evan communicates in English, French, and Spanish fluently. I now invite our feature presenter, Mr. Evan Green, to take over the show. Welcome, Evan.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with everyone. Nice to see some familiar frozen faces. And I wish we could be doing these things more in person, but it seems that the virtual is the way to go for the time being. So yes, thank you for that kind introduction. I am Evan Green. I know some of you already. And I've been with Baastel doing monitoring and evaluation and RBM related work for the last over 21 years, believe it or not. I know you look at this face, you say, I'm not sure that's possible, but it is. It's been that long. And the greater part of that has been doing a lot of RBM and M&E work in the Caribbean, where I wish I was right now, despite my background. I am not amongst you. But would like to be and probably will be quite soon. And for those of you who don't know, Baastel has been active around the world for the last over 30 years, doing a lot of monitoring and evaluation, the M, the E, the capacity building and M&E, all kinds of RBM and project management, project design related work and training. And I personally work in English, French, and Spanish, so I've had the pleasure of being not just around the world, but on just about every island in the Caribbean as well. So it's my pleasure today to take a little bit of your midday. Hopefully you're having some lunch while we speak. So you can get 2 meals at once. You see what I did there? We could talk about monitoring and evaluation, accountability and learning. That's the meal. And the idea is today that I will provide you with a little bit, just some of sort of the background, the concepts, the principles, the ideas. I want to present in particular the approaches that are used by Global Affairs Canada and USAID. I know a number of you on this call have quite a bit of experience with both of those. But I want you to just be comfortable with the sort of the MEAL concepts, tools, principles, but also see how GAC does it, how USAID does it in particular. And then because my time with you is really limited today, I'm going to try and focus in on one experience that we had implementing NEAL with one of these partners that actually got funding from USAID, so I can get it implemented in practice for you and get your views on that and share some cool tools with you that we got to use, in particular on the L piece. And of course, in our discussion period, if there's time, you can ask more questions. I'm happy to share other experiences that we might have had as well. And I know I'm talking to a highly capable, extremely experienced group in M&E. So you'll forgive me that some slides take a step back, looking at the M&E aspect, the backbone of MEAL, if you will. But I think it's important to sort of cover those things as well. And as we were chatting a little bit before everybody else came on the call, I think as many people would recognize, there's been a lot of talk about MEL, monitoring and evaluation morphing into monitoring, evaluation, and learning frameworks, systems, approaches, et cetera. And then more recently, monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. That I think you'll find, and I'm sure it's similar for all of you, but Baastel's work in monitoring and evaluation, and my work with a lot of the organizations that some of you work with as well, we've always had an MEAL approach. It's always been ultimately about the L, right? M&E to improve strategic planning, programming, decision-making, et cetera. But to start with, maybe we can just take a quick look at some of the definitions out there on monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. Oxfam looks at it that everyday program management it has as its core, and what's critical to the success of all of its development programs is monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning. These are all interrelated parts that feed into the success of all of their projects and programs. So sometimes it's viewed as a kind of overall management for development approach that seeks to improve the outcomes that we have, ensures that there's accountability for resources and the achievement of results, and also to share, communicate, and learn from data for lesson learning, for strategic evidence-based decision making. So when we talk about MEAL, we're talking about an approach to the design and the management, implementation, monitoring, and reporting of strategies, plans, projects, programs that support strategic planning and policy making, that ensure that there's legitimacy and accountability for the use of funds, be they donor funds, public funds, et cetera, to ensure that our focus is on the results that we're trying to achieve, and therefore promoting learning and efficiency and effectiveness, and making sure that you have the right feedback mechanisms that feed into program implementation. And time permitting, I'd really like to focus on that last piece, which is the L, which has been an area we've been trying to increasingly focus on in the last, in particular 5 years, but even the last 10 years, trying to get organizations to sort of tweak their approaches to have more of an L-based project and program management approach. And within the context of the Caribbean, it's worth mentioning that given that RBM and MEAL are intimately intertwined, the CARICOM heads, and we were working closely with the Secretariat for a number of years to sort of develop and implement an RBM system, which was very much focused on monitoring, evaluation, accountability, learning. RBM leadership group, which had as its terms of reference to continue this process of building capacity at the national level across the region to ensure that there was high-level RBM-based monitoring and evaluation frameworks, tools, plans, and systems in place to ensure that the A and the L would happen as well, a focus on accountability and learning. But any MEAL system is, of course, focused on RBM. I won't harp on this. As most of you know, I love to talk about RBM and M&E, and would be happy to be part of any sort of future full trainings on the subject. But RBM is really, it's a management approach, it's a philosophy, it's for me anyway, a way of life that really centers everything we do in terms of our planning, our implementation, our monitoring, our reporting around the results that we're trying to achieve. And it implies a change in the way we work, in the way we gather data, and manage data, share data, in the way that we design our projects and programs, and the way that we manage them, and then tell a story about them as well. But at its core, it's very much a change and a shift in focusing on, what was done, to what has changed, what's been achieved, what can we demonstrate that has changed as a result of our activity, and why did this happen, and how did this happen? And as we've been saying for the last 20 years in our RBM trainings, what can we learn from this? And therefore, what do we need to rethink or adjust for the rest of our project or our program, for the next project or program, for the next strategy, the next plan, et cetera, et cetera. And And as we know, the RBM approach itself came from an enhanced focus on accountability, where donors and development partners were trying to get a better sense of where all the bilateral, multilateral funding had gone and what results had been achieved on the ground. So that A part of NEAL has been a fundamental component of project design and international development and management monitoring and reporting for a number of years. And RBM is very much intertwined with that. It's at the core of, it was at the core of the MDGs, and now is even more so at the core of the SDGs, which has taken on much more of a robust approach to the M&E pieces in terms of very specific indicators and targets, and having countries report on those targets in a voluntary way annually, etc. So we see this intertwining of RBM and M&E as fundamentally linked together. When we break down the M, the E, the A, and the L, we all know what they stand for, but the monitoring piece is really about making sure that we have that ongoing flow of information that's going to shed light on the gaps and allow us to suggest corrective action during the project's lifetime or program lifetime, strategy lifetime, policy lifetime, etc. The evaluation is more the parachuting in at that sort of midpoint or the end point to get all of the full picture in place as to what has achieved all of our expected results, outputs, outcomes, impacts, etc. But all the other elements, the OECD criteria, if you will, overall sustainability, impact, effectiveness, efficiency, relevance, coherence, etc. Where things sort of trail away a lot in terms of project and program management and monitoring and reporting is the A and the L. And A is really important in terms of just keeping people in check and accountable to what are the results that we're supposed to be achieving with the funds that we have. And learning is a critical one because it enables the rest, right? In terms of ensuring that your organization or you as a project manager or a project evaluator are continuously growing and learning from the activities that you're implementing on the ground. So this is why when we talk about NEAL, it's not a technocratic thing. It's not just something that's at one level. It has to be owned by everyone. It really is. And we say this often about RBM, that it needs to be integrated into the operations, into the culture of an organization. And I think that it's critical to mention it here in terms of NEAL, because it very much is. And I want to get to that a little bit when we talk about the L. When we talk overall about these kind of approaches to NEAL, they echo very much when you try and simplify and make very practical and realistic any sort of M&E approach to your project or program cycle. So here I'd like to talk about NEAL planning, pardon the pun, that it's a very similar type of approach here, believe it or not. I remember being in both Cambodia and in Guatemala, of course, one of those being in Spanish, to sort of teaching M&E to non-experts. I know everybody here in the Zoom is an expert, so all of this is already well known to you. But we've always made this kind of connection that people do M&E more so than they might think. And so just imagine you're making supper for your family. You inevitably plan for what you're going to make, and you decide how you're going to get there. You're sort of building a logic model of what you're trying to achieve. Ultimately you do want a certain outcome of a great, tasty, healthy meal, and you have indicators for those. People are happy with it. People are smiling while they're eating it. They say it smells good. They say it looks good. They say it tastes good, etc. We need our inputs. We need our ingredients. We start with our activities. We start to implement our activities. That's the cooking. While we're cooking, we're certainly monitoring. We might be monitoring, the amounts that we're using, the smell, the colors, the heat, etc. So we monitor while we're doing while we're implementing, while we're doing those activities. We are monitoring and reporting to ourselves, if you will, and eventually where we kind of evaluate. Now, we may evaluate ourselves. We also have other people evaluate our work, and we listen to them. We gather data about what they like, what they didn't like, too spicy, too bland, to whatever the case may be. But the critical part that comes is when we sort of reflect on what we've done and what we could do differently. Did we have too many ingredients, too few ingredients? Did it cook too long, too short? Whatever the case may be. And the key to improving our cooking is applying that learning. So there has to be a way that we feed back that information into the strategic planning of the next set of activities that might have similar or even slightly different expected outputs, outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. So here we can see, and I've tried to draw, you'll notice throughout the presentation, from at least 10 or 12 sources, different organizations approaching meal. And here, this is from rescue.org and their meal handbook as recently as last year, where they look at it as, you have a design phase where you're looking at the theory of change, the log frame, you're building on previous learning that you've already done. You look at the requirements, the costs that you need, staffing they look at and thinking about the monitoring and the evaluation. As they get into the startup, the planning for the startup includes that kind of development of the M&E framework. How are we going to gather data? Where are we going to get the data? What are we going to use the data for? And then how are we going to learn from it, right? And implementing a meal plan is about implementing the data collection plan, making sure that you're gathering data appropriately from the right sources. If it's disaggregated, what are the methodologies they're using? Do you have a data quality assessment approach, et cetera? And then make sure that data is analyzed for validity and make sure that it's useful and make some tweaks if you need to. And then ultimately the foundation is when you ensure that data is not just captured and stored, but shared to maximize learning, and that it catalyzes cross-fertilization of various groups to share on the information that's coming out. And so therefore a roadmap for meal would look like any good roadmap for monitoring and evaluation, where once you've sort of developed a clearly defined set of expected results that you want to achieve, and the monitoring kind of tools that you need to be able to tell a story of whether or not you're making progress and why or why not, you then have to actually undertake that monitoring and reporting, gather that data, and then use that data to make adjustments and to learn and improve, et cetera. And key to all of this is the reporting. And there's always this kind of reluctance in monitoring and evaluation to share information that isn't telling the best story about successes on the ground. But I always argue in the M&E sessions that I'm a part of that, the best learning we do is when we actually don't achieve what we were setting out to achieve, as it is in our own lives. It is in project and program and strategy and plan implementation. It's when we have challenges or even fail that we learn the most about what we should or should not do the next time around. So you'll find that the development of any MEAL framework is very similar and embedded within any sort of project cycle management or project management or RBM framework, right? It's about having the right information at the beginning to be able to set the context and be grounded in the right expected results. It's about having the right indicators in place. It's about knowing the baseline situation. It's about having realistic, not just expected results, but annual targets. Having a process in place, whether it's a system or otherwise, to monitor those results. Then to make sure you have the right reporting mechanisms in place to share both positive and potentially negative information. And then making sure that data is circulating and being shared, and that there are spaces created for using those findings in order to influence not just this project or program, but other projects and programs as well. And that's your base meal plan, right? Is to make sure that you have a solid project or program or strategy or policy design in terms of the logic model, the theory of change, the performance measurement framework, the indicators, but then you also have a solid monitoring plan, an evaluation plan, a learning plan, data management plan. Where is the information going? How is it being shared? What about communication? And making sure that the reporting templates with all the partners involved are solid and consistent so that we can have some confidence that good information is coming down the road. And some of the standards that we find, if we look here, this is from Save the Children, but you find similar types of trends. That when they talk about monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning standards, They also say we need our clearly defined objectives. We need the right indicators in place. We need a logic model. We need a performance measurement framework. We need to make sure that we have an M&E plan that is resourced and budgeted, right? That M&E needs to be prominent enough within the project implementation matrix to be funded, right? We need to have a baseline. We need to plan for evaluation. We need to be able to have a space within our project management cycle to learn, right? And this is a key one, and I hope to bring in an example or two near the end of the presentation about how we've approached this with other organizations, because our understanding from some organizations, this is the sticking point, right? That the processes are not set up such that there's this ongoing learning. But some of the principles that we have found when we look sort of across the board with different organizations is that people that are focused on this meal approach have a focus on their beneficiaries. They also have a focus on standardizing the tools and the processes they use for not just project management, but also for monitoring and evaluation. There also seems to be a strong integration of monitoring and evaluation within the project or program cycle. And there is an organizational focus as well on continuous learning, on professional development, all these things, so that it creates this context for monitoring, evaluation, accountability. And we also have found a trend where, those who are focused on monitoring, evaluation, and learning, you find that certain tools seem to be used more prominently. Like, for example, a good stakeholder analysis at the beginning of any project or program to really map out who could potentially be affected by a particular project or program or policy or strategy. What are their needs? What are their major interests, expectations, et cetera? And then seeing who could be potential advocates for that project or program, potential opponents, could have an impact on the project itself. And then that helps us to start the learning process right away as we design the project or the program. But certainly any good meal approach, like any RBM and M&E approach, will have a good theory of change. I don't need to get into too much detail about the theory of change, but it's really about answering the if-then question of our activities to outputs, to outcomes, to impact. And make sure we thought about the context, the assumption, the causal chain, right? Mapping that logical sequence, as Global Affairs Canada calls it, the systematic mapping of the logical sequence through the causal chain of results, right? So when we think about the change we want to have with our activities that we're implementing, we have to think about the assumptions that are at play and what's the context, what's the real situation on the ground, and does our if-then causal chain really hold? And that's how we make sure that we have the sort of right theory of change in place. Those of you who have attended our RBM program will remember our genderless, faceless, person standing in the middle of the lake, where we look at our theory of change and we think about how if our theory is that if we're going to drop this rock in the middle of the lake, some of the water is going to hit the shore. We have to think about what we have control over and what we don't have control over. And certainly we have the ability to drop the rock, and we know that immediately there's going to be a splash. So we have some control over the outputs, but we have less and less control when we get out to the impact level. And therefore that has to be borne in mind when we think of our M&E plan, what's within our control, what's outside of our control, et cetera. But when we talk about an RBM-based MEAL plan, we also have to think about this focus on results. So getting away from thinking about activities. When we have two people doing the same activity, one of them could be focusing on cutting a rock, but the other one knows very well that they're building a temple or building a school. And that's the focus on the M&E plan as well. And how we focus on accountability and learning is we do want to monitor progress and learn about the school we're building and the temple we're building, not only about whether or not the rocks are being cut. And of course, we want to make sure that our results are SMART, as we know. I don't even need to ask this group what SMART stands for, but making sure that our M&E plan is built solidly on a very SMART results chain, which then forms part of our logic model. And again, this is all review for everybody in this group, but having done extensive research on MEAL globally, this is the backbone for the MEAL approach still. having a good solid logic model with a good set of outputs going to a certain set of outcomes that support an impact. Or in the parlance of Global Affairs Canada, we know, and a couple of other donors, but they are in the minority, we have the immediate outcome and the intermediate outcome leading to the ultimate outcome. There are some subtle but important differences between these two models of the logic model. Stick a pin, as they say. Anyone who has a question on that, please ask me afterwards, and I'd be happy to explain how these two different logic models work and what are the advantages and disadvantages of each one. But ultimately, we want to have a good theory of change, a good results chain that clearly answers our if-then question, recognizing where our control wanes and our influence might continue, where we make a contribution, but maybe we don't have attribution. And then for any logic model, of course, the key backbone piece that comes next for any MEL plan is going to be the performance measurement framework, right? We do need to think about all of these elements in order to feed our learning, just like we do for our project and program management. We need to think about, once we know what we're trying to achieve, how will we measure that? What's the current state? What's going to be the target after year 1, year 2, year 3? Where are we going to get the information? How are we going to get the information? How often do we get the information? And of course, you know, the column nobody wants to talk about, who is going to get that information? But we do need to talk about those things. And the last sort of piece that's really important for monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning is the risk matrix, right? We need to think about what are the risks to our project, to our program, and I would even say to our M&E plan. What are some of the risks that we have to our M&E plan that necessitate our action now? How do we ensure that any highly likely and potentially severely impacting risk is taken care of in our planning for monitoring and evaluation? So we have to sort of prioritize those and integrate those into our plan. And when it comes to our indicators that we're going to have at the core of our monitoring and evaluation and learning plan, you know, we want to make sure that they're going to be reliable and simple and useful and valid, but also neutral and able to be measured whether or not they are there is progress being made or progress not being made. So that's kind of a bit of a background, but I've started to segue a little bit into the type of meal approaches that are being used. I'll zoom in for a few minutes now on the Global Affairs Canada approach, though I've given you quite a bit of background. When you look at the MEL documentation from Global Affairs Canada, you will find a lot of this RBM material, right? For them, MEAL and RBM is intertwined, and they see it as essential, right? And in terms of the ability for the government to exercise stewardship and accountability standards. So it's about focusing on the achievement of outcomes, but also monitoring performance measurements, about learning, adapting, etc. So it's not just about you know, setting the right expected results and indicators, but then monitoring progress and the resources utilized using those indicators. And so again, the results chain for Global Affairs Canada goes from output to immediate outcome to intermediate outcome to ultimate outcome. And these are critical, and they feed into, you know, all the policies of the Canadian government and all the projects and programs that they do internationally as well. And it's a similar type of flow, an if-then type of flow, where again, the contribution and the influence increase as you go up to the ultimate outcome. Of course, they're the most important. You know, why we do the projects and the programs is for the health, for the quality of life, for the living conditions, the well-being, security, etc. But the outcomes that we intend to measure by the end of our project or program are much more about having the skills, attitudes, knowledge, awareness increase so that we have better decision-making, effectiveness, practices, policies, etc. So when I distill down Global Affairs Canada's considerations for MEAL, what you find is a strong results orientation, a focus on the theory of change, a need to have evidence-based decision-making, focusing strongly on assumptions, ensuring a participatory approach both in design and then in terms of sharing information for the learning piece, continuous adjustment based on good information being shared, continuing to manage risk. So using that risk management tool there's a slightly different, but it's along similar lines, using evaluations for lesson learning, having learning reviews, right? And this is a point I'll repeat a couple of times, the creation of spaces for project program managers, sometimes with stakeholders in the field, et cetera, to share information about what's happening, why, and what should be adjusted because of that. So in terms of the tools that they use, the key ones that we found are the theory of change, the logic model or logical framework, the PMF, the PIP, which is the project implementation plan, the risk register, the use of reports, use of evaluations, the creation of learning spaces, and then the feedback loops that are created between evaluations, monitoring and reporting, and the learning spaces into project and program design. And that piece is critical. Now I'd like to take a quick look at how USAID approaches MEAL, M-E-A-L. Many of you will probably recognize this, this circle. This is kind of the MEAL conceptual framework that USAID uses, with the results in the middle, learning, adapting around it, making sure that you have good sort of project design, implementation, activity design and implementation, M&E, fitting into a larger strategic planning, whether it's country, regional context, and just thinking about the policy level, the available resources and the budgets around that. But when they zoom in on the MEL framework, they don't call it the MEAL framework, but very similar, especially because the word accountability is actually in their framework. And it's a key part of the PMP. So they have what's called a project management plan. And in that project management plan, you're going to have the whole MEL plan and the tools, et cetera. You're also going to have a collaborative learning plan. But also part of their MEL approach is about what are the monitoring and reporting processes and systems we have in place? What capacity do we have in place for monitoring, for reporting, and for learning? And then what about the institutional relationships? How does a project or program fit into a governance and accountability framework at the country, regional, or even global level? And where that fits in the USAID context is that they have country development strategies for each country that map out sort of development objectives, and it's basically the theory of change for the country in terms of the development support that's being provided. It's a development hypothesis, if you will, and any project or program has to fit within that that country development strategy. And then there would be an MEL, or in their parlance, MEL approach that is part of the CDCS, the country development strategy as a whole, but then for each project or program. And critical to this is not just your typical pieces about the M&E plan, et cetera, but it also includes this collaboration, learning, and adaptation strategy that we need to include. And I hope to get there in a few minutes and show you an example of how we worked on this with one of USAID's partners in Africa. This is just an example of how the CDCS results framework appears. You know, they have, again, different parlance in terms of outputs and outcomes. They have sub-intermediate results and intermediate results. You know, in our typical RBM and MBE trainings, what we do is make some linkages between the different terminologies that different donors and development partners use, but it's very similar to the kind of output, outcome, impact language that you would mostly be familiar with. But when I drill down again to compare to Global Affairs Canada, the key tools that are used for MEAL at USAID, they have the results framework, they have a project management, a performance management plan, they have the country development strategy, they have a collaborative learning plan, they have indicator reference sheets, they use evaluation, they create learning spaces, and again, it differs by implementing partner to what degree learning is prioritized, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and they ensure the follow-up and the feedback loops from the monitoring, reporting, evaluation into the project and program design. In terms of our own experiences, and I knew I would only have time for one to share, I wanted to bring an interesting application that we did working with one of USAID's partners, implemented via one of their implementing partners, which is the United States Forest Service in Africa, a regional project. And where we started, of course, as an M&E group, we know the best place to start, especially once the design was already set in terms of both the CDCS and the project itself, we started to design the MEL plan with and for them. And this was a critical piece to allow us to really flesh out everything that was going to lead to the learning piece and would really be the glue in terms of holding the program together and to ensure that there would be learning throughout implementation. When it comes to any USAID project, you have to make sure that the MEL plan has, as you would imagine, the overall project, the introduction, the theory of change, the logic model, etc. Then you need a detailed monitoring plan, which includes all of the tools for data collection. Is there going to be a system, not going to be a system, etc. You need a detailed evaluation plan, including, terms of reference for the evaluation, a plan for systematic data collection, etc. And then interestingly comes the learning plan, the CLA plan, if you will. And I'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes, how we implemented that with the organization, because I think it's a learning piece, pardon the pun, for all of you, for the partners that you work with as well. I want to introduce you to one tool that USAID has that I think you'll find really interesting. Then you also have to develop a data management plan. How data is going to be managed by who, which sources of data, in which countries, across organizations, etc., ensuring that there's that flow of information, and reporting templates in the absence of a system, of course. Then you need some reporting templates that people fill out and that are easily aggregatable. So again, this was for the Africa Regional Program for Environment. It was called CARPI. And essentially, we helped the implementers build the MEL plan, which had, overall the basics in terms of the project from an M&E perspective, a full monitoring plan for this program, for this regional program, an evaluation plan, and a collaboration, learning and adaptation plan as well for the organization as a whole, and for this program in particular. This is essentially what the program log frame looked like. Again, I'm happy to share materials if anyone reaches out afterwards. We can sort of share with you the MEL plan we built for you to peruse at your own leisure. And the monitoring section was extremely detailed, and it contained everything you would imagine, right? In terms of, having, and we actually built an MEL plan into an Excel sheet, which perhaps I can share with you very quickly here. Hopefully you can see it on my screen right now. Maybe somebody give me a thumbs up or some sort of signal that you can see this Excel sheet in front of you. Anyone, maybe raise a hand if you see it. And also I can check to make sure you're still there and alive. Raise a hand if you see this Excel sheet. Thumbs up, thank you, whoever that was. So in this Excel sheet, you can see what we did. We built actually a bunch of tabs. First, we have the results framework, then we have the PMF, then we had some reporting templates that they would use to fill out.
Yeah, we're not seeing the actual sheet. We're seeing, I saw it at the bottom of the screen.
Maybe you need to scroll down.
Sorry, you're not seeing the sheet?
No, we're not seeing the Excel sheet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I can't share it with you there. Oh, wait, yes, I can. Hold on one second.
Yes.
Can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes. Great, wonderful. So sorry, yes. So we have you see, we built the results framework here, followed by the PMF, followed by a reporting tool and template that would be used by all the different partners in different countries to sort of report on different quarterly targets. Here we have the performance information reference sheets for each of them, and here's what they look like in detail. For those of you who have worked on indicator reference sheets, you know how meticulous you must be. In particular with USAID, we had to build this for each of the indicators. We stayed at the outcome level for the most part, but you can see we built all of that out for them. But that's the way we approached it then. That was before we actually had a system to offer the partners. But you can see that that was a key part of the MEL plan. Then the next part was the evaluation plan portion, where we really mapped out, the rationale, the specific objectives, responsibility, budget, et cetera, et cetera. And we even included the key evaluation questions that would need to be included in the evaluation. And apologies for rushing. I just know we're in a time crunch here, so happy to share more with you as you wish. But I wanted to zoom in on this part as I get to the learning piece. And this is where we had to really work closely with the organization to set up kind of a learning approach, right? Because for us, I mean, the M&E is almost a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. The gathering data on outputs and outcomes, et cetera, it's supposed to be a means to an end to improve programming, to improve strategic decision-making. So what's often missed is how to get from one piece to the other. And I think the L is that bridge, right? In terms of making sure that you map out, how are you going to get this information and learn from it? So first we mapped out how data would be organized, how would we maintain control on the data, responsibility, sharing, availability, access, all those things. And that was linked to the issue of reporting templates. And then we had to provide some training on the ground back in those days when we had sort of human interaction. Oh, I long for those days. And we would make sure that they knew what it meant to report on results, right? To make sure that the data that was coming out would be really focused on progress towards outputs and outcomes, focus on the indicators, measuring from the baseline to the targets, et cetera, to really ensure that we had good reports that would have meaningful results, that would take account of context, that would really bridge the gap between expected and actual, and really go back to the performance measurement indicators, and to really identify the challenges and the issues through the reporting. And that brings us to the piece about learning. This is the USAID CLA overview, if you will. In the program cycle, they see that the enabling conditions around learning are organizational culture, processes, and resources. And then during the program cycle, it's about collaboration, it's about learning, and it's about adaptation, right? And the CLA plan, which I think is an unbelievably amazing additional tool to add to any project, program, strategic planning activity, it forces you to think about these things. So meaning, what are the enabling conditions within the organization in terms of the culture? Is there a culture of learning, of improvement? So how does the organization view evaluation? When you come in as the evaluator, are you the enemy, or are you someone who is welcomed as a resource, knowledge? And then what are some of the processes in place around institutional memory? How many times have we learned the same lessons before? Does the organization keep track of these things and use that information for decision making? And linked to that is, how prioritized is M&E and learning in the organization? Do they put their money where their mouth is? And are there any resources for that? And then throughout the project or program, to what extent do we have processes in place for collaboration, right? To what extent are we learning from what we're doing? And do we have spaces for that to pause and reflect, as USAID says? And they actually called for in the project timeline for pause and reflect sessions. Are we pausing and reflecting every quarter, every half year, to think about where we're at, and therefore using the M&E data to learn, to improve? And this learning can be done in different ways. We've done it in various ways with different partners, whether it's sort of inserting them into the results frameworks through the back door, if you will, via indicators, et cetera, whether it's incorporating it into reporting templates and forcing them to answer certain activities, whether it's quarterly, biannually, or annually, whether it's about making sure you have the right meetings and therefore having the right agenda items during meetings to make them focus on those issues, whether it's using M&E, midterms or whatever the case may be, or finals to have everybody pause and reflect around the evaluation to sort of force a context of learning. And we've helped organizations think about what kind of learning questions they want to think about, over time. Where should the project be by now? What information did we gather last period? Where is it? Are we using it? What's working? What is it? What are some of the things that we've learned in terms of the contextual elements? What actions can we take, et cetera? And we've embedded that learning approach into what we call our systems development approach to strategic planning, monitoring, evaluation, reporting, and learning. Where we work with partners like we did there, so to develop a theory of change through the M&E, indicator development, PMF, evaluation frameworks and plans, learning plans, capacity development plans, et cetera, making sure that there's capacity building there as well, and then implementing that M&E system to actually gather information, to have an analytical approach to the reports and data that's flowing, and then to ensure that we're disseminating and learning from information as it's flowing through. And so our considerations for MEAL are not so different from Global Affairs Canada or USAID. It's a very collaborative and iterative approach. It's theory-based, but it's also practical. It's aligned with the best practices that we can find up to date. But it's also very transparent and impartial, allowing both challenges and successes to be shared. And it's very focused on capacity building throughout, so that we can embed more of a focus and capacity on monitoring, evaluation, and learning as we sort of disappear from these environments over time. So I would say overall, when it comes to our experience with partners, would be they government partners or regional partners or international partners, where the NEL approach can succeed is where there's really this cultural, for lack of a better term, institutional cultural is what I mean, willingness to change and improve, like an ownership of the monitoring, evaluation, and learning process. And that means a recognition of the benefits as well, right? That there's an appreciation of the process. But that's one quadrant. The other quadrant is, that there's actually a commitment to it, that there's resources and spaces created for learning that are based on results-based monitoring and evaluation. And that means that there's also capacity for that. And then you have to make sure that there is an actual ongoing sustaining coordination of those pieces. And that means you need committed leadership, you need sort of champions of change, you need M&E persons within the organization to keep things moving in the right direction, et cetera. I'm conscious of the time. I want to show you one more piece. We'll see in the Q&A if we can do that. But for now, I will stop there and we'll call this a overview of MEAL, approaches and tools from Global Affairs Canada and USAID, and a Baastel experience. And with that, I will stop talking and ask if there are any questions, and be happy to discuss for the last 10 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Evan, for that very informative presentation. The floor is now open for questions to the presenter. So please just open your mics and go ahead, please.
Hi, Evan. Thanks for sharing. My question is, how do you approach sharing meal processes with groups that are, when in low literacy context, where you spoke of that ownership, but how do you get groups that operate very grassroots to feel that ownership, because they often feel intimidated by meal and it seems esoteric to them? So that's my question.
That's a very good question. I feel like I need a little more context before answering that. But I think it's important to sort of, probably everybody on this call is an M&E expert in their own right. And it's kind of embedded in our roles and responsibilities to find a way to speak to our audience in a way that they will be able to relate to it and attach to it. So I guess the one of the questions is, what do you need from that organization? You know, what is it that you'd like from them, and how can you take the pieces from the M&E matrix, or the MEAL matrix, and present it to them and involve them in such a way that is beneficial to them, but also understandable to them and the people that they work with, while getting the minimal information that you would want from them. And it might be not approaching it with an M&E umbrella, but really just speaking to them within the context of what the program means to them, and how their voice can best impact the direction and shape of that program or project moving forward. So it's kind of like tailoring, taking a toolbox. You know, today we talked about a number of pieces in a potential toolbox to apply NEAL with organizations you work with. There are tons more out there, of course, and I'm sure many of you have lots of great ones. How do you take the pieces of that toolbox and tailor it and bring it onto the table of the person you're trying to reach the most? And I think that takes a little bit of thought and planning depending on who you're working with, but ultimately focusing in on why would they want to be part of it? How can you get them to give you the information that ultimately they also want, but you do also want? And sometimes that means taking bits and pieces of the overall M&E matrix and getting them to feed in the best way that you can. I know that's a bit of a generic answer, but I'd be happy to talk with you more even offline about what challenges you might be facing. Sounds like you're speaking about something very practically, something you're doing now. Happy to chat with you more about that if you get.
I'd love that. I'll get your contact from the host. Thanks.
Okay, pleasure.
Question, Evan, you spoke a lot about helping everybody prepare the TOC, etc. before. Have you had to go in and do an evaluation, let's say, having not done the preparation in terms of the PMF and the TOC, etc., etc.? And what did you find that's different and most challenging?
That's a great question. I feel like you're speaking from experience too, so that's interesting. I think just to your question, because I could interpret your questions if you would be some of your greatest challenges in evaluations writ large, but this one is sort of like not being part of the TOC, PMF, etc. What I have found really challenging, and you won't be surprised by this, is when you come in and you know right away that logic model and that PMF is a mess, for lack of a better term. I mean, it was already a mess. You can't believe it went through approval to get it. But now you're in a position where you might be coming in year 4, year 5, and sometimes it might even be a very large program. And I have found that I have to evaluate it on 2 levels, right? One is you have to evaluate it based on the expected results that they all agree to and the indicators that they had put in place, even though between you and I, they're all wrong, right? They're not set up properly. So they were off on the wrong foot. But nonetheless, an evaluation of that has to take place. However, I like to use the opportunity to under the larger criteria of efficiency or project management to actually assess the PMF itself. So it becomes not a way out, and not a caveat, but a contextual factor where I kind of say, I'm evaluating this and on its own merits in terms of what its expected results were. Here's what's been achieved and here's what we can learn, etc. But circling back to the design itself of the M&E tools, they were flawed. And what does that mean? And that might mean that in some cases we end up helping them draft some new indicators. Does it mean that those indicators are now retroactively, evaluated? That's in the minority. It's happened a couple of times, but not very often. In a midterm, you have much more room to get that done, right? You can often influence a revision to the PMF, etc. So I kind of evaluate the project based on the fact that PMF or that logic model or those indicators were done 4 or 5 years ago. But at the same time, there's going to be a solid piece in my evaluation that's going to healthily and constructively critique the PMF itself to say, here's where I think it could have benefited you to go in this direction. And therefore, I hope in phase 2 or a subsequent similar project, you will involve somebody from the CEI in the development of your logic model and PMF, and then maybe you'll be off on a better footing, and you won't need some short Canadian guy to come and tell you in year 5 that things should have been done differently in year one.
That's great. Thank you for that.
I am Zoe Simpson from the Women's Center of Jamaica Foundation. Other members of staff are on the platform as well. And I think I speak for them in registering our appreciation for this invitation to be a part of this webinar this afternoon. Quite informative and enlightening, mind you. As we sit here though, we are recognizing that we have some work to do, quite a bit of work to do in terms of meal, and we might have to get the assistance needed from CEI, of course, and the short gentleman from Canada, as you said. But really, this is an eye-opener for us, and we are trending in the right direction as it concerns us, or being more intentional about meal and applying the principles and practices to our program of intervention for adolescent mothers in Jamaica, mind you. Particularly coming out of the pandemic, we now recognize we have to, as we say in Jamaica, I don't know if you're familiar, wheel and come again. We have to rethink, we have to redesign, we have to return to the table to have a conversation as to how we are going to be addressing the needs, particularly of the older girls who are wanting to register in the program of intervention. So we're very happy. It's not a question, it's a comment then, that we're happy to have been invited. Thank you, Valerie. And I know going forward, therefore, that we are going to be at this table in a more fulsome kind of way, because we have a lot to learn ourselves as it relates to applying the principles and practices to what we do for the adolescent mothers. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
You're welcome.
This is Valerie. I know we're almost at the end of our time, but I just wanted to say, well, you know, so happy that the ladies from Women's Center could join. I believe that, and the question that came, I think from Cher about, you know, contextualizing the principles and so forth, so that a broad cross-section of stakeholders can understand and participate meaningfully, you know, in the process. Because, and this is a challenge, I think we are hoping certainly at some point to be able to work with the Women's Center and other entities to, what should I say, manifest how that whole process is contextualized meaningfully in our local Caribbean situation, you know, with these civil society entities addressing serious social issues. I know there are others in here who are from the private sector, and looking at, you know, that is a whole nother piece, I'm sure. But it's, you know, corporations also need to embrace the MEAL strategy. I'm sure they have other types of jargon that they use to kind of embody, you know, those necessities, because any organizations need to reflect and adapt and grow. But I think there's much to be gained by the private sector from integrating these processes as well.
And I see Andrea has her hand up, I guess maybe for the last word.
Yes, thank you so very much. And it's good to see Women's Center here. They're really impacting the nation, and we look forward to them changing the region as their meal gets strong. Thank you, Valerie, for acknowledging private sector. Private sector is typically not spoken about in these fora, so I thank you. As it relates to the grassroots, the point about grassroots needing to adapt, adopt, and own the meal, it is even more critical for grassroots, and I cannot see a way, proven time and time again, it is never, in my view, going to be possible unless evaluation is married with project management, aka monitoring. You're only as good as your monitoring mechanism, in my view. I've tested it with private sector development initiatives. And for me, when we see, the moment we see throughout the region that the two are paired, not married, but shown as collaborating side by side from day zero, meaning pre-design, conceptualizing, then that's where we're going to have a strong, replicable, and relevant and appropriate evaluation community throughout our region. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you for that.
Okay, colleagues. So Evan, thank you so much for sharing with us really important and insightful information. We know that all of us are busy. You're busy. You're doing this as a volunteer. Our participants are all very busy as well. So we thank our participants as well for attending. It was really fabulous having you here with us today. And we look forward to having you join us on another CEI professional development session in the future. Good day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Take care, everyone.
Bye.